Hey, what's good, people? Mr. Zensphere back again with another RENOISE tutorial. Today we are going to be looking at the very basic operation of RENOISE for brand new beginners. We'll just start with an orientation of the interface, around the interface, just so you kind of know what you're looking at and how to get around. So if you're familiar with digital audio workstations, some of this will be, pretty obvious. If you're absolutely new to electronic music production, then this will kind of cover the basic bases, so you know what you're doing in RENOISE. So let's just begin by going through the interface. Your interface should look something like this when you first open up RENOISE. Um, might be a little bit different. You might see a different logo here, different logo down here, things like that. But this is kind of the basic setup when you first open RENOISE, more or less. So just beginning at the upper left here, we have our transport panel. This is our play button. This will repeat the current pattern. So this just loops this one single pattern. Stop and then record. When record is armed, we get this red rectangle around the pattern editor. This is called the pattern editor, which indicates that we are in record mode. So then any keyboard input will add in notes, right? And this can be accessed by using the escape key. Play and stop can be accessed using the space bar. And this can be accessed by using Command F13, the loop current pattern. I hardly ever use this function. We have playthrough patterns or wraparound. So you can see when this is disabled, the playhead just scrolls through the pattern and then wraps around to the top. Whereas when this is enabled, the playhead is centered and the pattern moves around it. It's just kind of your preference. If you're working with shorter patterns, this moving playhead might be more useful. We have a visual indicator of where the playhead is moving over here on the pattern arranger, or pattern matrix, I think it's called. But I usually just leave it on this because I like to have my editing cursor kind of in central focus. This enables our metronome. We get our little beepy boopies. You can also enable a pre-count for the metronome if you're doing live recording, but we'll get into that in a little bit here. This button here is our block loop. So if we turn this on, then we're just going to scroll through this kind of predetermined number of steps. And the number of steps here is indicated here. This is our block loop size in a fraction of a pattern. So we have 1/4 of a pattern. I don't think that's actually true. I think this is, oh no, it is, because we have a 40 line pattern. So if we increase this pattern size, you can see that our block size increases as well to match 1/4 of the pattern. Put this back to 40. And then we can disable this here. You can also use, if you have a number pad on your keyboard, you can use the numpad enter to change or to turn on or off this block loop function. Sometimes this is useful if you're doing some detail work, just want to focus in on one little part of a pattern. That does get some use in my workflow anyway. Here we have our MIDI clock options. Usually I just leave it on internal, but if you have external hardware or are syncing with Ableton Link, which I think is being phased out of support. I'm not exactly sure on that because I don't really use it. But if you're using RENOISE with another DAW, your sync options are here. We've got BPM. BPM in RENOISE is very flexible. You can go all the way down to 20 and all the way up to, I think, 999. Yep. So you can run at whatever speed you want. And this button here, these little kind of open buttons next to parameters will get you to the automation lane for that information. So if you wanted to automate your BPM, you can just kind of click on this and then input some automation changes, and then your BPM will change. Same with LPB. So what is LPB? It's lines per beat. So this is kind of like the resolution. You can see here that we have 4 lines, and then we have a gray line. And these gray lines generally indicate where your beats are. If we change this value to say 8, then we have 8 lines in between each beat. Now the beats are still happening at 120 beats per minute. So the pattern's not moving any faster. It's just increasing in resolution, right? So it looks like it's moving faster because it has more ground to cover. But that's only because we're changing the number of beats. So if we change this down to 1, there are now 40 beats in this pattern. So it's going to take slower, or it's going to take more time, but we've lost all resolution. We can only have note events happening on each beat. So lines per beat is kind of a personal choice. Some people really like working at 4 lines per beat and using delay commands to change their timing. Some people like 8 lines per beat. Usually it's a multiple of 4. I tend to work at 16 lines per beat. If you're writing in triplets all the time, you might want to choose, maybe 12 lines per beat or 24 lines per beat, because this will then, if you have 8, you'll then be on the pattern, on the triplets with every 8 lines, if that makes sense. We'll get more into that later, but I find that 16 lines per beat gives me decent resolution for most of what I want to do, and every once in a while I'll bump it to a different value. One of the really cool and unique and interesting things about RENOISE is that it's really easy to do kind of unusual timings in the substructure of your rhythm by changing the lines per beat. So for instance, if you have, say, an odd number of lines per beat, 15 lines per beat, and you, say have like a bass drum or a kick drum and a snare, and then you've got some hi-hats, your hi-hats are going to be, jiggy or off or swung kind of like by default, because you can't land them on an even number of lines because your lines per beat is set to an odd number. So you can get some really interesting, like unusual timings by using, say, like 7 lines per beat or 9 lines per beat, 11 lines per beat, 15 lines per beat. It's kind of a fun thing to experiment with. And you can do some of that experimentation within phrases, which I don't know if we'll get to phrases today, probably not. If you want to keep your project lines per beat something more conventional like 16, but still want to take advantage of some of the unusual timing capabilities that RENOISE has. So velocity, this is keyboard velocity. We can set keyboard velocity. And here we're encountering a hexadecimal number for the first time here in this tutorial. RENOISE uses hexadecimal, or at least it has the option to use hexadecimal. Hexadecimal is base 16 counting, and it seems really abstruse and alien when you first encounter it, but once you wrap your brain around it, it's pretty simple. Basically, the numbers go 0 through 9, and then 10 is A, 11 is B, 13 is C, 14 is D, 15 is E, and 16 is F. So what this allows us to do is to encode a broader range of values within 2 digits. And this is part of kind of the tracker legacy of RENOISE, trying to be, basically to have as much capacity as possible and as efficient a programming footprint as possible. So velocities are coded hexadecimally, and you can just think of them simply as like 0 to 80, 80 being full, because beyond 7F you get 80. But this button just tells you when you input values from the computer keyboard, what value to input them as. So it goes 7F. And then if you have this not enabled, it just doesn't input any value. So depending on if you want, a specific value input from your keyboard, you can enable this option and set the value there. We may talk more about hexadecimal as time goes on. I imagine that we will. This is our octave navigator. So this just determines which octave of the keyboard the RENOISE keyboard is triggering as its base note. The keyboard layout basically begins with Z as C, and then goes up. There's probably a map. Read the manual. It'll show you. But you have basically 2.5 octaves to work with on the computer keyboard, and then this sets your base octave. Using command plus or minus will change the. Oh, I'm sorry, not command plus or minus, but command or bracket keys will change your octave from the keyboard. So that's a good handy key command to learn and know. Let's go even a little higher here. So this is our master volume. This auto adjusts the master volume to avoid clipping if it's enabled. I usually like to leave this off so then I can see when my audio is clipping and at least know that I'll need to deal with that at some point. This is our audio meter here, and it'll flash a different color when you clip. This is our MIDI mapping button. We can click this and open up our MIDI mapping dialog. All the mappable parameters are highlighted in green. And you can see if we get into, say, our mixer channel, you can map your mixer channel. There's lots that you can map. Oh, interesting. You can even map these views. I didn't know that. Always learning new things about RENOISE. It's a deep piece of software, so there's lots to learn. We'll talk more about MIDI mapping later. But this is your MIDI mapping button. You can also access it by hitting Control M. I wish you could close it by also hitting Control M, but that is not how it operates. These little buttons give you indicators for MIDI data passing through. This is your total song length. So as you scroll here, you can see that this changes from 0 to 1 second. And if you had more patterns, it would keep going up. CPU usage. Oops, sorry, I keep grabbing that toolbar. And then your clock time. Now these buttons right here are your kind of global view presets. And these are super important and super useful. And these can be mapped to key commands. And I think by default, they're mapped to the function keys. So you can hit F1 and it will retrieve this first global preset. F2 will retrieve this second global preset, F3 this third, F4 this fourth, F5 this sixth, F6 this sixth, etc., so on and so forth. And you can set these up however you want to trigger whatever views you find most useful. The RENOISE interface is kind of like oriented around these different views, which allow you to access different parts of the program. And kind of the quickest and most efficient way of accessing those views is using your key commands that correspond to these global view presets. And you can store a new preset by right-clicking on that button that you want to correspond to that view. I hope that makes sense. This field here is our spectrogram. RENOISE has a decent spectrogram that shows you frequency information for the sound that's playing. This can be alternated with track scopes. So this shows you audio that is being triggered on each track independently. So this kind of gives you an overview of what's playing and kind of the summed signal on the master scope. I wish that RENOISE allowed you to change the timing window for these track scopes. Then they would actually have more use, I think, as oscilloscopes. But as it is, it's just sort of like a visual signal of what sound is happening across various tracks. I actually don't end up using track scopes hardly at all. I find the spectrogram view to be much more useful, or spectrum scope, spectrum analyzer. And let's see, what does this do? This closes that panel and opens that panel. And we can also detach the mixer and track DSPs into a separate window here if we want to. If you have a multi-monitor setup, that might be a useful thing to have your mixer view and your track scopes or spectrogram on a separate monitor. We can get into the settings for the scopes here using this little icon right here. And you can see also, before we get into that, we have frequency values that are displayed as we scroll through this, right? So this is telling us what this value is in hertz as we scroll across, right? So if you need to target a particular frequency for EQ, you can just hover your mouse over that frequency peak, and then you'll know exactly what frequency it is. And you can see on the left-hand side over here, this is also giving us a decibel reference as we move vertically. So that's useful. This is the phase view over here on the right. The phase view shows you the extent to which your sounds are in or out of phase. That has some utility, and it's also pretty to look at. We've got scopes. Again, these are the track scopes, but we also have the left and right master scopes if we want them. So I generally leave it on spectrum. And then we have two displays that can happen simultaneously. And you're able to select what is displayed. By default, you have the master track and the selected track. And then you can change the drawing mode to a curve, a filled curve, a third of an octave block, or the spectrogram if you want something a little prettier to look at. I usually just leave it on the curve. I find that's useful for me. You have options for changing the speed and colors depending on what you're using for your drawing mode. I think that's more just for the spectrogram. You can change the color spectrum here, and you can also change the speed of the spectrogram. Again, I usually just leave it on curve. To me, that's kind of most useful, but you can do what you want. We also have options for choosing the frequency scaling between linear and logarithmic, block size, channel mix, peak fall. We can change this to be still or slow or fast or instant. And then we can also change the slope factor in the drawing. So those are all your spectrogram options. And again, the spectrogram is pretty useful. I love that it's integrated into the software. I use it all the time. We can see across here we have different panels, and these kind of correspond to our views to some extent, although the views you can set up with a little more specificity. This is our pattern editor tab. This is our mixer tab, and so it's bringing the mixer strips into view here. We have our sampler. RENOISE is basically a giant modular sampler. You can use it as like a Rompler synthesizer. I have tons of videos about native synthesis techniques in RENOISE. Just check my channel if you're interested in that. RENOISE also hosts plugins. So you can load, your favorite VST, whatever you like to use. If you use Serum or Vital, you can have that in RENOISE, whatever you want it to be. Let's go back to none. And then we also have some MIDI monitoring. I don't use RENOISE with external hardware, but you certainly can. You can use RENOISE to control external hardware, and you can have external MIDI passing through RENOISE as well, I believe. I haven't messed with this too much, so I'm not the person to help you figure this out, but it's here if you need it. So let's go back to our editor view. Let's keep looking at these different panels. So over here on the right, we have our instrument list. RENOISE is organized around an instrument architecture, and an instrument can consist of any number of samples. Let's go back to the sampler, which then appear here in this sample list. Right. So if we add in samples, I'm not sure that there's a limit to the number of samples. Maybe it's 256. Only 12 can sound simultaneously, but depending on how you have your sample key zones set up and your mute groups, you can have way more than 12 samples functioning in a given instrument, say if you have a drum kit or something like that. We'll get to that in more depth. But back to our instrument panel, this is where you access various instruments for recording, for note input. And RENOISE is kind of cool because instruments and tracks are sort of like separate things. So you can have multiple instruments functioning on one track. Or you can have, say one instrument just functioning on one track in kind of a more conventional, dedicated track to instrument relationship like you would see in a lot of other, maybe more traditional DAWs. The reason you might want to play different instruments on one track, say you have effects processing that's just functioning on one track, and you want to bring different sonic elements into that line of or lane of effects processing, you can do that really easily in RENOISE. So let me just record a little bit here. So we'll just record a few different notes here. You can see this C300. C3 is the note. That's the note number or note name, and then 00 is the instrument number. So this note event is telling trigger instrument 00 at C3. And this is saying the same thing, the same thing, the same thing. But we could trigger, say, instrument 01 or instrument 02 or instrument 03 at C3, all within the same track. So then you would have different instruments happening simultaneously in one track. You can also have one instrument triggering simultaneously on different tracks. With some limitations, provided you're not using instrument effects chains, which we'll get into later, you can do that as well. Instrument effects chains are one of the kind of more powerful features that RENOISE contains, and I think is one of the biggest selling points of RENOISE personally, because you have nearly unlimited, super flexible effects architecture within your instrument creation. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, so we'll talk about that soon enough. So this is our pattern editor. This is where the bulk of your composition takes place. I have a kind of a dedicated pattern editor view saved as one of my global view presets. And this is if I need to, kind of take a broader look, I can kind of see what's happening across multiple tracks. This maybe is your kick drum, this is maybe your snare, this is maybe your hi-hat, this is maybe your bass, whatever. You can organize it however you want. And then, you have your note data recorded. So let's take a little bit of a deeper look at what we have happening in the pattern editor here. So we have note data, and then we've got our instrument number, and then we've got this column here. And this column is our volume column. And we can change the volume column display, whether we want it active or not, by hitting this button here, or hitting, I believe it's Command-Shift-V. Yeah, Command-Shift-V. So volume is the same as velocity. And we can input, I believe it's the same as velocity. Maybe there's a distinction there, but I don't think there is. And we can input a value from 00 to 80 to trigger velocity volume for a specific sample. And you can have that velocity change across different lines. So you could do a little fade out, something like that, just in the pattern editor, right? So RENOISE is very flexible in terms of how you're dealing with samples. Let's just get a sample in here so that we have something to listen to. Let's do a cymbal, we'll do a crash. So now we have this crash cymbal that's being cut off. If we take that velocity information out, it just rings out. But we can use velocity to do all kinds of fun things, right? Just using that volume command in our pattern editor. So this is the volume command. We have also we have a panning column and we have a delay column. And this panning column allows you to, I actually don't use this very much, but I think it also goes from 0 to 80. Let's try that. this should bounce the sound across the stereo field. So you can see that in our phase meter, we're changing left to right. You can hear it if you're wearing headphones. If you're watching on a cell phone, you're not going to be able to tell because it's mono, but you can see that this is changing the stereo information. So you have kind of granular control over where samples appear in the stereo field as well. And then this delay column, this because RENOISE functions on this kind of lines per beat model, you might want to have even finer resolution than whatever your lines per beat is set to. You can use this delay column to offset the timing of note events. I think this is also, I can't remember if this goes up to FF. Yeah, this one I think goes up to FF. So you have FF is 256, so you have 1/256th of a line resolution. Although I think in practice, that's not really true because each line is subdivided into ticks. And I think by default, there are 12 ticks per line, which is sort of like your finest resolution. But I think you can also change that under the song options to 16 ticks per line if you want, all the way down to 1 or all the way up to 16. We didn't get into all this stuff. There's a lot of options. We will get into some of these things as the tutorials progress. Okay, so over here we have what's called an effects column. All right, this is a note column, and then this is an effects column. Each note column has volume or velocity, pan, and delay available to it. And we can have up to 12 note columns per track, right? And you can kind of fold or unfold them as you want. You can mute by left-clicking or solo by right-clicking whatever note column you want. And you can also rename these note columns. Say that's your melody or whatever, just to help keep your head straight about what's happening in each individual note column. Note columns are monophonic. So if you have, say a synth voice where you've got this note and then you've got this note's going to cut this note off. If you want both of them to play together, you need to move this polyphonically. You need to move this to a separate note column, depending on your sample properties. You could have these both playing together by changing the sample properties, but we'll get into that later. For now, it's kind of easiest just to think of polyphony requires multiple note columns. Okay? So we were going to talk about effects columns. Effects columns host a whole set of possibilities for control over the sound in RENOISE. There are effect commands, and then there are also effect commands that can impact, say, a DSP device that's on a given track. Each of these parameters can correspond to an effect command, right? So we could, let's see, if I do this, and then I do this, or let's see, if I do that, you can see this number just appeared. I right-clicked where this value is, and a new effect command has appeared. All right, so this number, 1258, 1 indicates that this is the first DSP. 2, I think, indicates that this is the second parameter. And then 58 is the hexadecimal value. And then C6 is the hexadecimal value. So this is first DSP, second parameter, and then the value are the second 2 digits. Those are effect commands for DSP devices. But RENOISE also has a host of internal effects commands that are usually combinations of letters and numbers. And we'll get into that in more depth in a future video. That one deserves its own video. But needless to say, there's a lot of control possibilities that you can have using these effect commands. So this is the backwards command. So just by inputting this B00, I can then tell RENOISE to play these samples backwards. And then if I input B1, I'm not sure if this is going to affect both the samples. Let's find out. So yeah, it then sets their play direction to be forward. So if we watch this in the sample editor, we can look at the waveform view. And we can see the playhead creeping in from the right side and then going back to the, and then moving back to the right. Okay, it starts out playing backwards and then moves forwards. All right, so you can do, say you did something like this, B1, B0, B1, B0. You could have this playhead. Oh, nope, I didn't hit it quick enough. Let's do something like this. Once it hits the end, it hits the end, unless you have loop. Let's see if this works. Kind of cool. So you have this kind of like granular control over the movement of the playhead, and there are lots of other effect commands that impact other aspects of how the sound behaves or how the data behaves that you can use in interesting ways. Okay, and then you have as many tracks as you want. You can rename your tracks. Just double click here. Call this, we'll call that crash, right? And you can, I don't think you can rename effects columns. That'd be handy if you could, but you can't. C'est la vie. And I think you get maybe 8 effects columns per track. Let's see, I don't think I've ever used all of them. Usually I just have like 1 or 2 going. Yeah, it looks like 8 is the maximum number of effects columns you can have triggering simultaneously. So up to 12 note columns, up to 8 effects columns per track. Since this takes up quite a bit of real estate on the screen, you can also fold these tracks in. I believe that's Command K. Nope, sorry. Command Shift K, maybe? Yeah, there we go. Command Shift K will do that. And there are also key commands for adding and subtracting note columns. I usually just do it manually, but sometimes you want to do the key command if you're doing it a bunch. Key commands are a huge part of RENOISE workflow efficiency. There's a lot to learn, but we'll get into that in the future as well. So we have our tracks moving to the right here, and then eventually we get to our master track. This is where all the audio is summed. And then to the right of the master tracks, we have send tracks. So you can use a send device to send audio to a send track. This is send 01 enabled by default. And we have some options for how we want to send it, if we want to keep the source or mute the source, post mixer volume and pan, and then we can send the amount and the panning. And that's something that we can talk about later. But basically the signal flow, if you use a send device, is audio goes sent to whatever send you're using, and then that goes back to the master track. So the master track is kind of like where the buck stops. That's what sends to your audio interface, and this is kind of like your final stage of processing available on your master track. Okay, so we've got instruments. We talked a little bit about tracks and track architecture. Tracks can also be grouped. You can do Command G to group a track, and you can select other tracks to bring them into a group. It would be nice if you could select multiple tracks and group them all at once. I don't know why you can't do that, but RENOISE has weird limitations, so you have to do that part manually, but whatever. And then you can have, say, effects processing just on this group track. So there is quite a flexible architecture there. You can nest groups. You can group this group if you want to, and have other groups within groups. Yeah, but in general, audio is processed from left to right in RENOISE. So that's just something to keep in mind, and that'll come into play in a couple situations in the future. So we've got our instrument list over here. This instrument is very simple. It's just a sample without any modulation, but we are able to trigger it and have some sound happening. And when I hit Command K, it actually duplicated that pattern over here. So this is our pattern editor. These are buttons for our pan delay and effects columns. So this, what does that do? That adds an effects column or takes away an effect column. We also have this handy kind of reference for different effects commands. So this tells you, kind of what these different effects commands do. And again, we'll get into that in a future video. But just know that that's there if you need it. This is the currently selected track is all that's visible, right? So it collapses everything else, just kind of for efficiency and ease of editing. If you move your cursor to another track, it'll expand tracks as you go. I usually leave that off, but you can put it on if you want. And then this moves continuously between patterns while editing. And when it's off, it wraps around the edges. So say you want to edit the pattern, we just go back to the beginning of that pattern if this button is off. Sometimes that's handy. This button, when it's on, sends DSP sliders to automation, and we'll talk about automation. And when it's off, it sends them to pattern effects commands. So like we had it before, when I right-click here, it's sending this data to an effect command. If this button is on, and I say we're here, and I right-click here, we just created automation data. And you can see that represented by this little automation symbol here. And if we go to our automation slider, hit only, we can find drive, and we inputted this value in the drive column. But we'll talk more about automation in another video. I don't want these videos to get too long. So this is our pattern editor. This is our pattern arranger. There's a lot that we can do here. We'll talk about this, I think, in another video. This is probably good stopping point for today. Again, I don't want these to get super long. So hope this was useful for you. Hope this helps at least get you a little bit oriented. And we'll continue with this beginner series as time goes on. All right, keep being awesome. Make lots of music. Peace.